Hi, and welcome to the Business and Society podcast. Before we jump into this week's episode, I'd like to wish you a very happy new year. I started this podcast with a single mission to educate leaders about the powerful role businesses play in shaping our societies. Over the past few months, we have explored important topics with thinkers who are at the forefront of their fields. It's been encouraging to see listeners tuning in from nearly 70 countries. That said, there is still a lot of work ahead. There is significant scope for us to reach more listeners and bring even more ideas into the conversation. With that in mind, we are making 3 updates to the podcast. First, we will continue to bring the world's leading thinkers and practitioners to discuss some of the most pressing issues at the intersection of business and society. Second, we will begin inviting emerging leaders whose work has the potential to make the world a better place. And third, we are introducing the Right Way series. In these episodes, my co-host Vihan and I will share inspiring stories of courage, ethics, and integrity from business history. I've always wanted to spend more time unpacking the business stories that our guests reference in their interviews, and The Right Way gives us the space to do exactly that. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. And now, on to today's episode. Today, we are talking about women in the workplace. Joining me is Professor Cordelia Fine. Cordelia is an acclaimed writer and scholar of science in the History and Philosophy of Science program at the University of Melbourne. Cordelia is known for her sharp, witty critiques of popular ideas about brains, evolution, gender, and diversity, and her book, Delusions of Gender and Testosterone Rex, are widely prized and have won many awards and accolades. She was named a living legend of research by the Australian newspaper and awarded the Edinburgh Medal for her contributions to public debates about gender equality. I sat with her to discuss some of the ideas from her most recent and fascinating book, Patriarchy, Inc., which was listed in the Financial Times What to Read in 2025, the nonfiction category, and Best Summer Books for 2025 in the business category. Cordelia, great to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Lovely. I just work a few blocks from your office, but I got to know about your work from Naomi Kahn and June Carbone, 2 exemplary scholars. We've shown a lot of admiration about the scholar called Cordelia. So I went and started doing research. Then I started following your work. And in preparation for this interview, I got an opportunity to read your latest book and what are contributions you're making to the society and the discussions on genders.
Well, that's wonderful to hear because as you'll know, I feature their work in my book. Their scholarship is really a really fantastic contribution as well to understanding why it is that despite the sort of rise of women in terms of educational achievement, they haven't made the gains that one might hoped that they would have in the corporate domain. And I'm a real admirer of their work and found it extremely helpful for my own. So yes, I love the connection. That's how you found out about my work.
That's awesome. Tell me, what experience or moments in your career set you on the path to the work you do today?
Well, going many years back, I didn't work in the area of gender at all. My PhD was on the parts of the brain involved in emotional processing. And then after my PhD, I was doing work in moral philosophy and moral psychology. And the way that I found myself catapulted into the domain of sex differences in the brain and behavior was actually because of an experience parenting. My children are grown now, but when they were young, I read a lot of parenting books, sort of typical academic, like let's research how to do that. And one of the books that I read was saying that boys should be treated differently to girls, parented in very different ways because of these sort of fundamental differences between the brains of males and females. And I was quite curious about this because I'd studied the brain. I did my PhD at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience. People weren't really talking about sex differences in the brain. But when I looked at the studies that were being cited as support for these claims, I was really shocked at the disconnect between what the studies actually could tell us and what the popular writers were claiming. And then I looked, and there were these, books for managers, books for people in, relationship books, all these different kinds of books, all drawing in very, very suspect ways, just very bad popular science, claiming that the new neuroimaging technologies told us, everything we'd always suspected all along, that men and women were fundamentally different. And I thought, well, this isn't right. So that's when I wrote Delusions of Gender, which is my second book. And I should just add, given the nature of this podcast, is that there are some, I would say, some diversity consultants who are very careful based on the evidence, very cautious about the way they talk about differences. But there are some diversity consultants who partake in some of the most egregious gender stereotyping that I've seen in my career, and it's really very unhelpful and very scientifically inaccurate. So, anyway, to return to your question, that's what really brought me into the domain, and I found it quite fascinating, and here I am still.
That's interesting. Tell us, what is this patriarchy in?
Yes, so I'm using the term. There are lots of different ways of defining patriarchy. I'm just using a very simple definition that psychologists in particular often use to refer to a kind of hierarchy of status and power over resources. So it's a situation in which men collectively enjoy higher status in society and have more power over resources. And by Patriarchy Inc., I'm really referring to the sort of various cultural, economic, and social factors that shape the gendered division of labour in our contemporary post-industrial societies, or in ways that help to are both kind of cause and consequence of this gender hierarchy. Or to put it even more simply, I refer to Patriarchy Inc. as the sort of gendered dynamics of who does what work in our societies and what they get in return.
Interesting. Such a serious topic, but the sense of humor that runs through the book is simply amazing. You are such a gifted writer. I think very few writers I've seen who handle such a serious topic with that humor running all through the book. So just wanted to highlight that. And I think I read this in your book or your speech in King's College London. You have said, one reason I wrote the book was to prevent gender equality from becoming dead dogma rather than a living belief. What prompted that concern? Because I work in the nonprofit sector. There's a lot I hear about gender equality. So when I read this, I felt a sense of disbelief.
Yes. So I think what really troubled me was that gender equality has become one of those things that everyone believes in. So everyone kind of thinks that gender equality is a good thing. And of course, that's a relatively recent situation. It wasn't quite so long ago in, places like Australia or the UK where, it was just taken for granted that men should be in charge, for example, or a sort of superior version of the species. But there's just so much disagreement. We don't really interrogate what it is that we actually mean by gender equality. And in Patriarchy Inc., I kind of take aim at two different visions of gender equality that I see as really diverting us from the important path of fixing those gender dynamics that I refer to as Patriarchy Inc. So one is this, what I call the different but equal perspective, which is the idea that, we have gender gaps in wages and wealth and leadership positions, and in we have gender imbalances in certain kinds of industries and occupations, but it's not anything we should worry about. These arrangements are quite fair, and they reflect, evolved natural differences between males and females that were sort of genetically set, tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago. And so we, in terms of the workplace or work, there isn't really a gender equality problem to fix. We already have gender equality. And then on the other side, the kind of main opponent to that is what I call the business case, DEI, or diversity, equality, and inclusion, which is really focused not on what the original goal of diversity was, or as equality, as it used to be called, equality and affirmative action, which was, of course, to create more socially just societies and recognizing the central role of work in creating greater social justice for women and other marginalized groups, but instead focusing on the benefits to businesses or to the economy of including women in the workplace. So this mantra, gender equality isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And my worry there is that there's sort of progressively been a bit of a reframing of this original problem, which was gender inequality and injustices, has been reframed as the problem of how do we extract more value or profit from women's labour. And depending on how familiar people are with these kinds of spaces, they might think, oh, well, look, people just have to be pragmatic, and, it's important that, businesses can't go bust solving problems of social justice, etc. And I do recognise the appeal of business case arguments, that they have their place, etc. But I just want to give you an example, and this was actually since my book was published, of, just where we've gone in this dialogue. This was something called, there's an organisation called the Diversity Project in the UK, which is around trying to create greater diversity in the financial and investment sector. And they recently published a piece of research, which was, basically looking at, what makes for good decision-making within teams, what kinds of dimensions of diversity really matter. And not only was it sort of really de-emphasizing the role of demographic diversity, because in fact, the data on that are pretty unclear. There's a sort of decisive case, but really making the claim that diversity was always about just creating teams that could make better decisions, that could make us more profit. That was, we got distracted by all this justice stuff. It was always just about the business case. And it's like, no, that's what businesses, that should, we should take it for granted that businesses should be trying to, create teams that are making good decisions. That is not the same thing as workplaces actually striving to create genuinely equal opportunities and rewarding people fairly and playing the role that they need to play in solving this very complex problem of gender inequality and, of course, other forms of inequality too. So to me, that was a very interesting example of just how far that business case narrative has taken us.
Let's talk about the different but equal perspective. So one of the ideas you strongly disagreed on your book is the innate sex differences lead men and women to do different roles. Could you talk a bit of the evolutionary perspective in simple language for common audience? What is that evolutionary story? Why do we start believing that men and women are set to do different things, and how it is affecting their career opportunities at modern workplaces today?
Yes. So one of the things that I wanted to do in the book was, this is the differences between men and women. We're fascinated with it, and scientifically, it is a really fascinating question. And we often think about there being two competing camps. One is the idea that we've evolved to have differences, and those differences are sort of built into us through our biology, so through our genes and through our hormones that create different brains, that create different kinds of personalities. And then there's a non-evolutionary story that ignores the fact that, like all other animals, we are also evolved, and that just focuses on how gender is socially created. And what I wanted to bring out in the book is that actually there's the flourishing scientific program that is interested in the key role of culture for our species in our evolutionary history. So this idea that, to an extent that no other species comes close to, we rely on culture, we rely on cooperation, and we rely on social learning to solve the problems of survival and reproduction. So what I point to in the book is this way of thinking about the division of labor as a kind of culturally evolved adaptation. Back in history, deep history, it would have been efficient to divide labor by sex, even if those divisions were completely arbitrary, either physically or psychologically, though, of course, some divisions will make sense and because of the physical differences between males and females and the reproductive differences. And then the idea is that because that's beneficial, that will be inherited. It becomes part of the sort of cultural inheritance of a group, and it kind of ratchets on over time. And of course, as species, we are social learners. Our psychologies are set up in ways that we acquire norms, we acquire identities that are intrinsically motivating, and so on. And so in a sense, there's this really nice match between people who've been studying gender, the social processes of gender, the way that gender norms influence our sense of ourselves, influence the interactions that we have with each other, and are embedded into our institutions. And this isn't a kind of side story, and then there's also this sort of other evolutionary story going on. We can actually see them as all part of this sense of understanding of ourselves as deeply cultural creatures, and for whom cultural adaptations, cultural traits like norms, practices, organizational forms, identities are actually part of our evolved inheritance. So that's one side of things. And then the other side of it is to actually just look at the empirical evidence in terms of just the sheer diversity of arrangements in terms of how we divide labor. Using sex categories to divide labor seems to be universal across human societies, but we have an explanation for that. It kind of, it's a very salient difference. Every population is going to have roughly equal numbers, etc. But the way that labor is divided is very flexible. It's sometimes counterintuitive, and it's often very arbitrary. Then when we also look at the psychological traits of men and women across time and place, we also see an immense amount of diversity, pointing to just a great deal of flexibility in how we develop. So how the culture and the environment around us shapes our development. So all this diversity puts a lot of strain on a kind of traditional evolutionary psychology story that our gender divisions of labor, even in our kind of post-industrial societies, which of course are quite far removed from a sort of hunter-gatherer ancestral past, are a kind of genetic legacy of, earlier evolution. The argument that I make in the book is that actually when you look at the diversity that we see on the record and the arbitrary patterns and so on, this kind of cultural explanation offers us a much better explanation of what actually is going on.
And I'm sure you did extensive research on the prevailing status of women in workplaces. I'd like to hear what did your research say. And I also seen recurrently that you're very unhappy with finance sector and to some extent tech. I'm also keen to know, why did you pick those two sectors?
Right. If anyone from the finance or tech sector is listening, it's not personal. It's not personal. So status. One of the things thank you for mentioning the humor in the book. And one thing that I also tried to avoid was the sort of words that maybe, we don't always enjoy hearing, like, privilege and things like that. But status is a really core concept. And I think when we're trying to understand gender inequality, and status refers to the sort of esteem or honor or respect that's associated with people, groups, and positions. And once you develop culturally shared beliefs that men are more status worthy than women, or, whether it's other groups, we're talking about white people versus racial minorities, for example, it can be very self-perpetuating. So one reason is that these status beliefs can give rise to conscious or unconscious behaviors that exclude members of lower status groups. So discrimination, backlash, various forms of sexual or racial harassment. But another important way that these status hierarchies remain and perpetuate is because higher status groups also tend to have more power, and so they can ensure that the way that resources and respect are distributed are in ways that tend to favor them, their attributes, what they do, their activities, and their life patterns. And as a result, they just tend to have an easier time making claims on organizational resources. So, we get clues of the sort of gender dynamics of that in various ways. So, one example is the work of economists showing that as a occupation becomes more female dominated, even holding other important things equal, the wages tend to decrease, so it becomes sort of lower in prestige and pay, for example. Or there can be kind of more micro level studies. So there's one really interesting study that I talk about in the book that was looking at the relationship between performance evaluation and bonuses. And what they found was that overall, men would tend to get bonuses that were much larger than women's and certainly weren't explained by how they were performing in their evaluations. But this was particularly exacerbated first when measuring performance was quite subjective, so that allows sort of much more room for bias to creep in, but also when the leadership of the organization was very male-dominated. So there's this close link between being male and status. And in the few organizations that were actually female-dominated in terms of the leadership, there was actually the reverse. So you saw the women like reaping higher bonuses even when their performance didn't merit it. So this was a kind of nice micro example of how, not necessarily with any intention of bias, just being in an environment where status is associated with masculinity, or in rarer cases with femininity, being female, is just kind of shaping who's seen as, rewarding, most meriting, the most generous bonuses, the highest pay, and so on. Now, the reason that I focused on finance and tech was that, to me, these are interesting illustrations of the way that there are these dynamics in our economies that when opportunities blossom, it tends to be higher status groups who flood in. Okay, and finance and tech are really good examples of that. So one of the things that I talk about in the book was the way that computer science, for example, didn't start off as a kind of masculine coded occupation. It was often seen as being quite suitable for females, and often described in it's very routine work. It just requires people who are conscientious. It's like embroidery because it requires all this patience, etc. And of course, it's a fairly complex story, but to simplify it, it's as computer science began to the opportunities started to rise, that's when it this masculizing process began, and the women started to be crowded out. There's another, I didn't talk about this in the book, but there's another really interesting example of this that comes from Australian science. So this is work by historian Jane Carey, who studied women in Australian science and discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that women actually used to be very well represented prior to in the pre-war era. And it was actually only when science became something that was seen as being not just an interesting hobby, but something that became professionalized, something that was useful and that was valuable, that was when the men began to crowd in and the women were kind of pushed out. So again, a really interesting story of the way in which, as an occupation starts to gain status, gain opportunities to acquire wealth, then it starts to become created in the image of the most powerful groups in societies. Finance has dreadful statistics when it comes to the marginalization of women in leadership positions, major financial institutions, banks, etc. And I don't think it's a coincidence that some of the best salaries and opportunities come from that sector.
I get the gender dynamics, but the other way to look at the same problem is power dynamics, you subtly touched upon, which cuts across many ways, right? People can discriminate based on race or migration status. Did you explore the other dimensions as well, or it's purely a gender-based lens?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I was focusing on gender, and one of the reasons for that is that, of course, those particular dynamics, in some sense, have a commonality across the many different countries that I was interested in looking at. So it's not specifically looking at Australia or the US or any particular country in Europe. And I think to do a decent job, for example, of looking at racial hierarchies, I don't know how helpful it is to look at those in a very homogenous way, but there are examples through the book where always these gender hierarchies are always intersecting with, in particular, racial hierarchies and hierarchies of class. So, of course, there's no singular experience of being a woman. And in terms of how women are doing in the workplace, the white middle class professional women are doing the best, and it's the immigrant women or women who have less education who are doing the worst. And even when it comes to caring responsibilities, those differences are quite different. So, for example, for professional women, it will be the norm of the ideal worker who is working really long hours and constantly available. that will create difficulties for women who are in heterosexual households where gender norms mean that she's more likely to sort of pick up the slack at home. Whereas for women in, for example, casual work, with the sort of pushing of the risk of supply and demand onto workers with sort of, irregular schedules or, just-in-time scheduling, that creates these sort of horrific clashes between caring responsibilities and getting to work, not to mention lower wages that make it harder to outsource any form of childcare. So, throughout the book, there are different examples of ways that these play out differently depending on, not all women are the same, not all men are the same. We have these sort of intersecting categories. But yeah, the general, the general idea is we have both kind of what are called diffuse status categories. So these are ones that are sort of culturally shared across society. So status categories around gender, race, and class, for example, or ability and disability. But then we also have our kind of local status hierarchies that for within our organization. So, my organization, that would be, we have clear hierarchies in terms of the academic staff, and then we have our executive and our senior leadership, etc. And what I was trying to explain in the book is that, of course, it's not, people aren't just looking at gender. They're looking at status is infused into lots of the different identities that we belong to. But what you start to see is that when you have, for example, a position where the people who hold those kinds of positions tend to belong to members of culturally lower status groups, whether that's to do with gender, race, or education, or a combination of those things, those groups, all else being equal, are going to have a harder case making a claim on organizational resources. And so, one of the really interesting quantitative studies that I looked at was looking at this sort of inequality between production workers and managers. So you can look at, what's the average wage of the production worker, what's the average wage of the manager, and you can look at the inequality between that. And what this particular research found was that, even controlling for things like education and experience, when production workers tend to be female dominated, or in Australia, I believe tend to be sort of native English speakers, there tends to be this larger inequality between the production workers and the managers, and if the managers tend to be, white, native English speaking males, then there tends to be this sort of higher inequality. So it's an example of how there can be a lot of variation among workplaces, and the way in which the kind of status and the recognition and the rewards that particular groups of people will get within an organization is kind of going to be subtly shaped by, well, who's doing that job. So it moves away from that sort of hope of the economists that employers and the mechanisms of supply and demand will ensure that people are getting kind of a fair wage for their contributions to the organization. This is showing how this kind of cross-cutting of the kind of local status hierarchies and the sort of broader cultural hierarchies are shaping who gets what in return for their labor.
Is patriarchy relevant to workplaces only in developed or OECD countries, or it's applicable across? Because when I was reading some of the examples you have cited, I saw an inclination towards developed economies. Just wanted to clarify that.
Yes, I did. I was focusing on those economies, and the reason is that those are the places where people are saying, we're done. We've fixed this. We've fixed this problem now. And I think probably to some extent, I'm not sure if this is the case, but my sense is this is where we're hearing a lot of the business case DEI. So the sort of two targets that I had for the book, the business case DEI and the different but equal, I see as being very dominant across the sort of OECD countries. So that's why I was sort of focused on those data. Yeah.
Great, very clear. Thank you. You have not been kind at all for this idea of DEI, but many believe that DEI is a path to equity, whereas your argument seems that it works against its own goals. I'm keen to understand what led you to this conclusion.
So one thing I think it's important to do, and I do this in the book, is I kind of distinguish between what we might call small d diversity, small e equality, and small I inclusion as principles, which I'm 110% in favor of, versus how they can manifest in organizations. So capital D, E, capital I, and in particular, focusing on this kind of business case narrative. So I think, I acknowledge that the way that organizations go about diversity and their diversity initiatives can be very varied. I think there are some organizations that are doing really good things, and I am, aware of examples of that. But I was sort of really paying attention to, as I said, this sort of business case narrative and the kinds of diversity initiatives that I think that we tend to see falling out of that business case DEI. So as I said, my concern with business case DEI is that it's reframing this problem of gender inequality as a problem of not extracting enough value from women's labor. And of course, we can extend that to other marginalized groups, such as, racial or ethnic minorities or the LGBT community, for example. You see these kind of business case arguments there as well. And I think because of this reframing, it's sort of reframing it as, we're not recognizing or fully utilizing female labor. Diversity initiatives tend to focus on individuals. So we might have leadership or development programs to try and help women lean in or be better about showing off their skills and their expertise, or to develop it. We create flexible work policies so that women can kind of fit in full-time work around caring responsibilities. Or we bring employers in and give them anti-bias training, or we set gender targets. Or we focus on gender representation in top management teams, because we've read consultancy reports that suggest that when we do that, we'll sort of somehow magically start to make more profits. And, the issue with that is that, as I try and explain in the book, so these inequalities tend to be embedded much more deeply, and these kind of initiatives aren't going to be enough to really fix the problem. So, for example, leadership and development programs, first of all, there's relatively little evidence that they actually work. They can foster resentment and divisiveness, because the men can be like, well, how come the women get to go to this thing and we don't? But they also don't address things like what's been called the motherhood penalty in job quality. So that's where this is work from the Global Institute of Women's Leadership at King's, showing that mothers tend to be in jobs that are less well paid, have less opportunities for promotion or training, or and worse conditions. You can create flexible work policies, but unless you do what is actually very difficult, hard work of reforming these norms around having ideal workers, you're really going to kind of end up sort of channeling people who perhaps take up those flexible work policies, sort of channeling them into lower status tracks, or just enabling people. Hee Jung Chung, who, the director of the Global Institute of Women's Leadership, describes this as sort of flexibility as enabling, facilitating self-exploitation among professional workers. So it gives us the flexibility to work everywhere, all of the time. We can encourage managers to sort of better value traditionally feminine traits and abilities like empathy and collaboration and teamwork. But, again, first of all, this is kind of stereotyping. It's a bit insulting to men. Men are capable of empathy, collaboration, and teamwork. But also, if you don't actually change what gets rewarded in your organization, how what kind of, is it the team workers and is it capacity builders and the facilitators who actually get rewarded in advance, or is it the sort of ruthless, self-promoting types who get rewarded? You can't just sort of pay lip service to feminine without actually doing the work of making sure that those qualities do actually get recognized and rewarded. And of course, focusing on having women in leadership positions. One thing that's really interesting about this from an academic point of view is this is a way in which the business case values have sort of permeated academia too, in terms of what we study, what we think is interesting to study. There's a lot of research trying to look at whether having gender diversity on top management teams does enhance profit or performance or innovation. Relatively little research looking at to what extent it actually helps other women in the organization, and same with racial diversity. And, simply putting women or a racial minority in a group in the top management team isn't necessarily going to have trickle-down effects in terms of, helping, the immigrant worker who's on a 0-hour contract cleaning, for example, or the part-time workers who are in low-paid work with, non-negotiable pay and few prospects for training or promotion. So, I just think the business case DEI has really taken off the table sort of the kind of deeper reforms we really need, while at the same time perhaps creating the false impression that simply by appealing to the self-interest and economic interests of managers and key decision makers will get the job of gender equality done. And I think that's really quite overly optimistic.
Mm. Ideas such as motherhood penalty on one side, but on the other side, there are ideas like reverse discrimination. I think one of the statistics I read in your book, about 1 in 2 Australian men feel that this is getting too much. Talk us through what's really happening there. How are men feeling?
Yeah, so when you look at the data on sort of gender attitudes, as you say, you're getting with Australia, UK. I mean, look what's happened in the US. There's obviously a lot of resentment and a lot of feeling that men are being discriminated against. So one thing we have to recognize is there is a lot of variation in how men and women are being treated across kind of different industries and occupations. So, for example, one of the studies that I looked at was looking at gender bias in apprenticeships across a range of different industries. Now, there wasn't a single industry that was biased against men. And there were some particularly male-dominated ones like construction where there was a very severe bias against female applicants to apprenticeships. I don't think you would see a sort of similar level of bias in sort of intake, entry-level jobs in certain kind of corporate sectors. But I think the larger point here is that when you're thinking about diversity initiatives, I think there have been initiatives that the evidence suggests are not particularly effective, or there isn't good evidence that they are effective, but at the same time can be a bit divisive. So, anti-bias training, there's a lot of research suggesting just dragging people in, giving them mandatory training, and then sending them out again is not effective, but it makes people feel like they're being told that they're biased and they're prejudiced. These leadership and development programs, again, there's not much evidence that they're actually effective, and it makes it feel like women are getting special treatment. And on the other hand, there are kind of things that you can do that are going to be particularly beneficial to perhaps to women or people with caring responsibilities who tend to be women, but that are not sort of singling out women for a particular focus. So it might be something, flexible work would be one kind of example, but actually creating norms where flexible work becomes actually acceptable. Or to give you an example that I heard about since writing the book, this was an IT professional services actually in Australia. And this is not a gender thing or a diversity thing, but they kind of explain to their clients before they come on board. They say, look, our consultants will work really, really hard for you during business hours, but they're not available at evenings and they're not available at weekends. And, they provide a really excellent service. They're not getting burnt out. They're not doing a lot of unnecessary busy work. But they're creating that boundary around their consultants' time, and they're explaining that to the clients. Now, that's kind of beneficial for everyone. It's probably going to make it easier for women to do really well in that organization. But it's not a sort of singling out of women for gender targets or for special training or anything like that. So I think when there's going to be a change in status and power, there's always going to be backlash and hostility and resentment. You're just not going to be able to avoid that. But there are probably ways of creating positive change and creating more genuinely equal opportunities that are both more effective and less divisive.
I was also reading a recent statistics that say more women graduate out of college now in many parts of the world. Um, Even in schools, girls outsmart boys in
Yeah.
their academic scores. What is leading to these changes? What would you attribute this to?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like I'm probably not very well equipped to answer it. I probably need like a historian of, of education to give a really solid answer to that. But I think one thing that it's probably worth saying is that, gender norms harm everyone. So they undermine everyone's ability to sort of pursue things that are important to pursue, including education. And I think that, people who look at the way that gender norms play out in schools find that there can be just as there's variation in organization, there's variation among schools in, for instance, how much being a good student, a kind of diligent student being interested in studies is coded as being like a girly thing, like you're a girly swot if you actually want to learn and pay attention and do well. And I think schools that allow that kind of gender norm, sort of feminine stigmatizing of learning and education, allow that to proliferate, are really doing boys a very grave injustice. I don't think there's any intrinsic reason that there should be fewer young men going on to tertiary education. It is something that needs to be fixed. At the same time, we should also be aware that there are the better paid trades, plumbing, being an electrician, etc. At the top of this sort of manual labor, at the top of the sort of best paid jobs in the kind of manual labor sector, those are male dominated. So it is still possible to, not get a college degree and still earn a decent wage. Though, of course, I don't know what the data are like in Australia, but of course in the US, we do know that non-college educated men, they're really doing very, very poorly. And, it's hard to promote equality for everyone where you've got a group that is, really falling backwards.
Well, another question, again, you may not be an expert in this, but because you said, your transition to this area of work started from your parenting experience. So I ask you as a parent, I have a son and daughter at home, and your work touches on culture a lot. As parents, what are one or two simple things we could do in our own households to ensure that kids learn from their childhood about some of the biases and the things?
Yeah, great. Yeah, so again, I don't feel like I'm a parenting expert, despite how wonderfully my children turn out. I can't really take credit for that. Yes, well, I think so. Things like, children do watch what's happening, of course, in their household, so they do see who is caring for them or doing the domestic labor, and I guess whose paid work is getting priorities and things like that. I think, children are just from a very early age, from the earliest age, they're picking up correlations between gender categories and other categories. But at the same, I guess it's for each parent or all parents to decide for themselves the kind of gender related values that they want to impart to their children. So it's really not for me to, I guess, to tell people how to raise their children. But I think the other thing to say is that we also have to recognize that parents can also only do so much. And so sometimes people will say, I did everything to try and raise my children in a gender neutral way, but they still kind of conform to gender stereotypes. And we do need to recognize that parents aren't the only source of information about gender in their children's lives. Children live in hugely gendered cultures, toys, games, media. As soon as they go to kindergarten, they start to be exposed to gender stereotypes. This is a little example, but I remember when one of my son's kindergartens used to have a dress-up day, and there was a little girl at the kindergarten, and she went to the dress-up day as, I can't remember, like as a pirate or something like that. And all the other girls were dressed up as princesses. And she was the only girl who was dressed up as a pirate. And of course, I noticed that the next dress-up day they had, she was a princess too. So she could see, like, this is how girls dress. And children are very, they're very sensitive. Once they get this sense of, I'm a girl, I'm a boy, they are very sensitive to what it means in our culture to be a girl or a boy. So, parents can be alert to that. But in some sense, there's only so much you can do. We live in a very gendered culture, so we can't take up all the burden ourselves of sort of degendering our children's lives. I guess we can just give them the language and the concepts to notice it around them.
Great. If you are advising a CEO today, what is the single highest leverage structural reform to make workplaces fairer?
Oh, I think that it's hard to give that sort of generic advice because I do think there is so much variation in organizations. So for some, it might be really long hours, greedy jobs that demand constant availability, that are over delivering, for example. For others, it might be that you have, casual workers who don't have control over their schedules, and that's, creating, terrible clashes between, getting to work and caring for children, or the pay is so low that families are having to work really long hours or work a third job just to survive. Others might have one of the things that I talk about, and this comes, in part from the work of June Carbone and others. There's pay for performance schemes, which can create, terrible inequalities and all sorts of, exacerbate in-group biases, for example. I think my answer is that there probably isn't a single answer, and that's maybe part of the problem, is that organizations tend to sort of just bring in kind of off-the-shelf solutions like diversity training or things like that without really taking a close look at their organization and thinking about how and where are these inequalities being generated. Work isn't being properly recognized, and what can we do about it? That's a very unhelpful vague answer, isn't it? But it's hard to pull out one single thing because I think there is so much variation in organizations. And some organizations are probably doing pretty well.
Great. Okay, now we got a few minutes left. This is a final section. I call it as how I did it. So I ask all my guests 3 standard questions. So first question, how did you manage differences of opinion at your work? Particularly the area you work, I think you'll face disagreements almost every corner. How do you manage them?
Oh, well, it's a very controversial area. And the way I deal with it is just to do what academics are trained to do and paid to do, which is to focus on evidence and arguments and leave personal attacks or speculations just out of the picture. So, in my book, I didn't want to just preach to the converted. I wanted to present evidence and arguments to people who are pretty skeptical, who might belong to the kind of different but equal camp, for example, or think the business case is the right way to go. So that's how I do it. I think academics are not always very good at that. There can be a lot of like, oh, you just hold that belief because of your political values or because you're on the other side, because you're a bigot or a sexist. I don't find that very helpful. I think academics just really need to focus on evidence and arguments and also recognize that there are legitimate differences of opinion. Like, these are complex issues. And, when it comes to, for example, objections to a particular diversity initiative, yes, the sexists and the bigots are going to be against it, but not everyone who's against it is necessarily against it because they're a sexist or a bigot. They might have really legitimate reasons for thinking that this isn't a good idea. So it would be, I think it's really important to try and listen to other people's point of view without making assumptions about, evil motives that might be driving their opinions. That's what I try to do. And I think that's sort of that's what I try and teach my students how to do in the classroom when we talk about these issues. I present them with the best case for both sides and leave it up to them to decide. And it's a really useful skill because we need diversity of opinion to get to good answers, to try and seek the truth. Yeah.
Great. The second question, this may sound redundant. What is a key skill that's required for business leaders today? So the earlier question was about your scope of work, but this question is more broadly. If I work in the business space, what is the skill you recommend that leaders must have?
I'm going to call it moral muscle, and there's a term that comes from someone called Mary Gentile, who has developed this extraordinary business ethics curriculum called Giving Voice to Values. You might be familiar with it. And basically what she wanted to do was She tells the story wonderfully. She talks about how she was teaching ethics in a top business school and feeling that it was an exercise in hypocrisy because there were all these sort of corporate scandals. She felt like it was just, window dressing. What she wanted to do was develop something that was not about kind of, the usual ethical frameworks, but starting from a different point, that people experience these conflicts between their own ethical values, responsibility, fairness, compassion, etc. They can see something going on in their organization that doesn't seem fair, that's not taking responsibility, that's not honest, whatever it might be. Once you know what the right thing to do is, once you think you know what the right thing to do is, how do you get it done? And it's a really great curriculum for thinking through, how would I get this done? What would I say? To whom? What information do I need? How do I do it? What kind of approach do I take? Do I need allies, etc.? And then, scripting, practicing, strategizing. And she calls this, developing moral muscle. We can role play what we might say. And then it means when we're in the moment or the time comes, we're ready to say, to take action to try and reform our organizations to make them more ethical. And when I was teaching business ethics or ethical leadership at the Melbourne Business School, I would teach this as, had sort of more theoretically based stuff, but I was also teach this very practical stuff. And the students found it really helpful. So these were often executive or senior executive leaders. Sometimes being on an MBA, it's just an opportunity to have a break from your work, to get away. And they would often use their own situations and use this curriculum to work through it, to think about what's at stake for whom, what their strategy might be, who they need to talk to, what the series of events might be, and to really sort of think about what pushback they would be likely to get and how they would respond to those objections. It's very, very practical. It's a really nice system. I use it myself sometimes. I found it quite effective. So, yeah, I think that's a very important skill for leaders who might often see something in their organization that they think needs to change. And it's just a really practical set of skills and ideas for thinking about how you might implement that change effectively and safely, because these things always come at a risk to oneself, of course. And part of it is thinking about how likely am I to succeed? What are the risks? And then making a decision about, whether you would go ahead or not. Because it's a sense of fear and futility that I think that stops people from speaking up. Like, it's futile, I'm not going to change anything, and I'm going to be alienated or even lose my job. So this is a way of trying to combat those two factors that tend to prevent people from speaking up and doing something.
One book you recommend to our listeners?
I am going to recommend a book that I read recently called Empire of Pain: The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty by Patrick Radden-Keefe. I came onto it because I was teaching a course on bad science, and I became really interested in the opioid crisis. And the Sackler family, as many people listening will know, are the owners of Purdue Pharma, that created and aggressively marketed the opioid pain medication OxyContin. And Empire of Pain is the sort of story of the Sacklers. It goes right back to a sort of earlier generation, but it tells the story of their role in sort of creating Purdue Pharmaceuticals and how they responded during that sort of growing opioid crisis. Fascinating book. Reads kind of like a crime novel, a real page turner, impeccably researched. It's a really extraordinary and very fine piece of work. So really recommend it. Yeah.
Lovely. Cordelia, what a pleasure and honor talking to you today, and deep dive into your work and get exposed to some of the new ideas which shook some of my own assumptions about gender at work. Thank you so much for joining me today.
No, thank you. That's very generous. It was a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.
Excellent. That was Cordelia Fine sharing insights on her amazing new book, Patriarchy, Inc. You have been listening to Business and Society podcast, where we explore diverse ideas about business and society with leading thinkers and practitioners. If you enjoyed this conversation, please follow or subscribe wherever you listen and share it with someone interested in the intersection of business, purpose, and impact. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.